She signed the divorce papers on a Tuesday morning while his mistress sat in her chair through the glass partition smiling. She was 5 weeks pregnant. He did not know. He did not ask. He checked his watch twice while she signed her name, as if her heartbreak was an inconvenient delay between meetings.
The risks are too high.
He handed her a settlement generous enough to buy her silence and sent his driver to deliver her to an apartment she never wanted. She took a yellow cab instead. That was the first decision she made for herself in 3 years. What Damian Blackwood did not know, what he could not have imagined in his penthouse full of marble and silence and absolute certainty, was that his ex-wife was already 3 moves ahead of him, that the company he was preparing to conquer had already been quietly taken from beneath him, that in 6 months he would be standing in his own office watching a live Bloomberg broadcast, champagne in hand, celebrating a deal that no longer existed, because the woman he had dismissed was standing at the podium as the new owner. Visibly pregnant, completely in control, and not remotely finished. This is the story of what happens when a man mistakes a woman's patience for weakness, her silence for surrender, and her exit for defeat. He was wrong on all 3 counts. And the price of being that wrong was everything. Lesson statement. Before we begin, here is what this story is really about. The skills you gave away for free inside the wrong relationship are still yours. They go with you when you leave. And the world outside that relationship has no idea yet what you are capable of. Neither perhaps do you. But you are about to find out. If Isabella's story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar or true or like something you needed to hear today, then you already know why we make these stories. Hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second and it tells us to keep going. It also helps this story reach the woman somewhere out there who is sitting in a yellow cab, hand on her stomach, telling herself she is going to be okay and not quite believing it yet. Maybe this story will find her. Maybe it already found you. Leave us a comment. Tell us, at what moment did you know Isabella was going to win? Or tell us what you would have done differently. We read every single one, and your answers genuinely shape the stories we tell next. Share this video with one person, just one. The friend who is rebuilding. The sister who needs to hear that starting over is not the end of the story. The woman in your life who has been quietly underestimated by someone who will regret it. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do it now and ring the notification bell. We release new stories every week, stories about resilience, about second chances, about the kind of strength that does not announce itself until the moment it absolutely has to. We will see you in the next one.
What happens when a man who has everything throws away the one person who truly mattered? When he mistakes love for weakness and resilience for defeat? This is the story of Isabella Hartley, a woman who was handed the worst day of her life and quietly turned it into the most powerful move on the board. And this is the story of Damian Blackwood, a titan of industry who thought he was closing a chapter, but was actually signing his own reckoning into existence. By the time it was over, one of them would be standing at a podium before the entire financial world, visibly pregnant, utterly triumphant. And the other would be watching from a penthouse that suddenly felt like a prison, holding a champagne flute that shattered on the marble floor like everything else he thought he owned. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Every earthquake begins with something quiet. A hairline crack, a held breath, a pen scratching across the thick cream paper on a cold Tuesday morning in October. This is where our story begins. Isabella Hartley had lived on the 50th floor of Blackwood Tower for the last 2 years of her marriage, not as a resident, but as a visitor in her own life. The apartment she and Damian shared was a masterpiece of controlled elegance. Every surface was either glass, marble, or brushed steel. Every object had been selected by an interior designer whose only instruction from Damian had been the word clean. No clutter, no softness, no evidence that human beings with complicated inner lives actually lived there. Isabella had smuggled in small rebellions over time, a ceramic mug with a chip in the handle that she refused to throw away, a slightly overgrown potted plant she had named Gerald, who sat on the kitchen windowsill with the particular dignity of a creature who knew he was not entirely welcome, but had decided to stay anyway. 3 paperback novels stacked on the nightstand on her side of the bed, their spines cracked with the evidence of real reading. Damien had never commented on any of these things. He had simply not seen them. That, Isabella had come to understand, was the defining quality of her marriage. Not cruelty, exactly. Not indifference, exactly. Something more precise than either. She had become invisible inside her own home, not because Damien wanted to hurt her, but because he had genuinely stopped registering her as a separate human being with her own interior weather. She had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard with a degree in economics. She had been on the fast track to a senior position at one of Boston's most respected venture capital firms when she met Damien at a charity auction in the spring of her 29th year. He had been 37, already legendary, already the subject of profiles and publications that used words like ruthless and visionary in the same sentence as if they were compliments. She had not been dazzled by his money. She had been dazzled by his mind. In those early months, he had talked to her like an equal, leaning across restaurant tables to argue about emerging markets, laughing when she pushed back, genuinely listening when she made a point he hadn't considered. She had believed, with the particular confidence of a very intelligent woman who had not yet been proven wrong about something that mattered, that she had seen the real man beneath the armor. She had not been entirely wrong. She had simply not understood that the real man beneath the armor was also afraid of the real man beneath the armor, and would spend the next 3 years methodically dismantling everything that made him feel exposed, including her. The dinner, where she had planned to tell him she was pregnant, had not happened. She had set the table herself, lit candles, made his favorite meal from a recipe his late mother had written on an index card that Isabella had found tucked into a cookbook she'd bought at an estate sale. She had thought the gesture would mean something. She had thought a lot of things that turned out not to be true. Damien had texted at 7:43 in the evening, "Singapore crisis, don't wait up." She had eaten alone at the candlelit table, the index card propped against the centerpiece, her hand resting on her stomach where a secret the size of a walnut was growing in the dark. The next morning, Marcus Vance had called to schedule the divorce meeting. The signing room was everything her marriage had been distilled into a single space, cold, expensive, and designed to make one feel small. Damien sat on the other side of the mahogany desk in a Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, checking his watch with the particular expression of a man who has already moved on and is simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Through the glass partition behind him, Isabella could see Veronica Cole. Veronica was 29, the kind of beautiful that required significant financial investment to maintain, and Damien's vice president of strategy, a title that had apparently expanded in scope sometime in the last several months to include territories Isabella had believed were exclusively hers. She was sitting at Damien's secondary desk, Isabella's desk. The one where Isabella had spent countless evenings quietly reviewing deal structures and offering insights that Damien had initially praised and later simply absorbed without attribution. And she was reading something on a tablet with the comfortable ease of a woman who had already measured the drapes. She looked up once, met Isabella's eyes through the glass, and smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who believed she had won something and wanted to make sure the losing party understood the scoreboard. Isabella looked away. She did not give Veronica the satisfaction of a visible reaction. She had already decided, somewhere in the long, sleepless hours between Damien's text and Marcus's call, that her visible reactions were hers now. They belonged to no one else. Not to Damien, not to Veronica, not to the marble-faced lawyer sitting beside the divorce papers with a pen extended in her direction. "Just sign," Damien said. His voice was the same tone he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. Not angry, not sad, simply finished. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. She was looking for something, she realized. Some hairline crack in the facade. Some shadow of the man who had argued with her about emerging markets across restaurant tables, who had laughed when she pushed back, who had once held her hand on a rickety boat off the Amalfi Coast and been, for exactly 1 hour, just a man who was happy. There was nothing, only the watch and the waiting. She uncapped the pen. The scratch of the nib against the thick cream paper was the only sound in the room. Isabella Hartley. Her signature was steady. She was proud of that. She pushed the papers back across the desk without a word, stood on legs that felt entirely reliable, walked past the silent executive assistants, stepped into the elevator, and waited for the doors to close. They closed. She put her hand on her stomach. "It's just you and me now," she said to the empty mirrored elevator. "And I promise you, we are going to be more than okay." Downstairs, Arthur the driver was waiting with the Rolls-Royce door open, his expression carefully neutral with the particular skill of a man who had witnessed many difficult things in service and knew his job was to be invisible during them. "No, thank you, Arthur," Isabella said, managing a real smile for him because he deserved one. "I'll take a cab today." She hailed a yellow taxi. The driver had the radio on. Taylor Swift's "Shake It Off" filled the back seat with a cheerfulness so wildly inappropriate for the occasion that Isabella laughed out loud, alone in the back of the cab, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying simultaneously at the cosmic absurdity of it all. She looked up once at the gleaming, arrogant spire of Blackwood Tower, disappearing behind her. It wasn't an ending, she thought, it was an eviction. And evictions, she had learned in Harvard economics, were just market corrections in disguise. He had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. He simply didn't know it yet. The luxury apartment Damien had provided as part of his generous settlement was on the Upper West Side, and it was exactly what it was designed to be. A very beautiful, very quiet reminder of everything Isabella no longer had access to. Every sleek surface and designer object carried his fingerprints, not literally, but atmospherically. The space said his name without ever saying it. Isabella spent the first weekend selling most of it. She kept the bed because she was pregnant and needed sleep. She kept the kitchen equipment because she needed to eat. She kept Gerald the plant because Gerald had survived this far and deserved continuity. Everything else went to a consignment service that sent a team of 3 young men with an enormous van and very few questions. By Sunday evening, the apartment was nearly empty, and for the first time in 3 years, Isabella could breathe inside 4 walls that felt like they might eventually become hers. Her best friend Chloe Merritt arrived that Sunday night with 2 bags from the grocery store, a bottle of good wine she was fully prepared to drink alone, sparkling water for Isabella, and the particular brand of fierce, practical love that had been Chloe's defining characteristic since the 2 of them had met in an art history lecture freshman year at Harvard and bonded over their shared conviction that the professor was spectacularly wrong about Caravaggio. Chloe was an art curator, sharp-tongued, deeply loyal, and constitutionally incapable of diplomatic dishonesty. She surveyed the emptied apartment with the eye of a woman who appreciated negative space and said simply, "This is better already." Then she put down the grocery bags and opened her arms, and Isabella walked into them. And for about 4 minutes, she stopped being strategic and simply fell apart in the way that only felt safe with someone who had known you before you knew yourself. Then she straightened up, accepted the sparkling water, and said, "Okay, here's what we are going to do." Chloe pulled out a notepad, because Chloe always had a notepad. Isabella picked up a marker and walked to the bare white wall of the empty living room. They worked until 2 in the morning. By the time they were done, the wall looked like a small explosion of organized thought. Timelines, names, numbers, arrows, question marks. In the center of it all, circled 3 times in red marker, were 2 words: innovate dynamics. The next morning, Isabella bought an IKEA bookshelf. She assembled it alone at 11 at night, cross-legged on the hardwood floor in mismatched socks, the instruction manual rotating in her hands as she tried to determine which end was up. Gerald watched from the windowsill with his customary dignified silence. She finished the bookshelf at 12:47. It was slightly uneven on the left side, but structurally sound. She sat back and looked at it, and looked. She had built something today. Small, imperfect, entirely hers. She thought about the wall covered in red marker. She thought about the $47 million sitting in a Swiss blind trust that her grandmother had quietly and brilliantly hidden away against exactly this kind of day. She thought about Veronica Cole's smile through the glass partition. She got up, went to bed, and slept better than she had in months. The call to the Swiss lawyers had been the one she'd been most afraid to make, not because she expected bad news, but because she had never fully allowed herself to believe the inheritance was real. Her grandmother, Eleanor Hartley, had been a formidable woman, a self-made textile entrepreneur who had built her business from a single loom in a rented room in Connecticut in the 1960s and turned it into a company that employed 200 people by the time she retired. Eleanor had been quiet about money in the way that people who have genuinely earned it tend to be. No performance, no display, just the steady confidence of someone who knows exactly what she has. She had also, it emerged, been quietly investigating Damian Blackwood for approximately 8 months before Isabella's wedding. The senior partner at the Geneva firm, a measured man named Aldrich Brennan, who communicated primarily in the register of someone reading a will at a funeral, told Isabella this with the careful neutrality of a professional delivering information he found personally interesting but would never say so. Your grandmother commissioned a private financial and personal background assessment of Mr. Blackwood in the year prior to your marriage, Mr. Brennan said. The findings were, shall we say, not entirely favorable. She chose not to share them with you at the time, as she felt it was your decision to make freely. However, she structured the trust specifically to ensure that if the marriage ended, you would have access to independent capital that could not have been touched, claimed, or leveraged by him during the marriage. Isabella sat in silence for a moment. She saw something in him that I didn't, she said finally. She saw something in him that you did see, Mr. Brennan said, with the closest thing to gentleness his professional register would permit. She simply chose to protect you from the consequences while hoping to be wrong. He was not wrong about the amount. $47 million, after fees and exchange adjustments, available immediately. Isabella called Chloe from the parking garage of her building. $47 million, she said. There was a brief silence. 47. Chloe, I am focused on $47 million. I need you to focus on the number in a quieter way. Another silence. Then, in a slightly lower register that still contained considerable volume, Isabella, your grandmother was an absolute legend. I know, Isabella said. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. I really know. The research phase took 6 weeks and was, in its own way, the most satisfying work Isabella had done since the early days of her marriage, when Damien had still valued her input. She worked from the spare bedroom, which she had converted into an office with a proper desk, 2 monitors, a whiteboard that was perpetually covered in color-coded notation, and Gerald, who had migrated from the kitchen windowsill to the office windowsill, apparently having decided that this was where the interesting things were happening. Innovate Dynamics was a mid-cap technology firm, publicly traded, with a stock price that had been quietly underperforming for 3 years. On the surface, it looked like exactly what Damien had said it was when Isabella had first pitched it to him 18 months ago across their dining room table. Fundamentally broken, leadership uninspired, not worth his time. She remembered his exact words. "Sweetheart, stick to dinner parties." She had stuck those words to the corner of her monitor with a piece of tape, written in her own handwriting on a small yellow note, not as a wound, as fuel, because what Damien had seen was the surface. What Isabella had seen, back then and saw more clearly now, was the interior. Innovate Dynamics had a research and development division that was, by any honest assessment, years ahead of the market. It held a portfolio of 17 patents in logistics optimization technology that had never been properly commercialized. Its customer retention rate was exceptional. Its workforce, particularly in technical roles, was deeply committed and deeply frustrated by leadership that neither understood nor supported what they were capable of. It was not broken. It was mismanaged. There was a profound difference, and the difference was worth, by Isabella's conservative modeling, somewhere between $300 and $500 million if the right person took the helm with the right strategy. She reached out to Julian Croft through a mutual contact at MIT, framing the initial conversation as an informal industry discussion. They met at a coffee shop in Boston on a Wednesday morning in December, Isabella 7 weeks pregnant and running on chamomile tea and focused determination. Julian Croft was 38, tall, quietly intense, with the kind of mind that moved in multiple directions simultaneously, and the particular frustration of a person who has spent years watching excellent work be ignored by people with authority and no curiosity. He arrived 5 minutes early. He ordered black coffee. He shook her hand with the directness of someone who had no patience for social performance. He slid a USB drive across the table before she had finished her first sentence. "I've had this ready for 6 months," he said. "I've been waiting for someone to actually look at what this company can do." Isabella picked up the drive. She looked at him. "Then let's make sure someone finally does," she said. The drive contained 3 years of internal R&D documentation, project roadmaps, patent assessments, and a strategic analysis Julian had written himself, titled, "With the Dry Precision of an Engineer Who Had Given Up on Subtlety." What this company could be if anyone in leadership understood what we do. Isabella read it on the train back to New York. She read it twice. By the time she reached Penn Station, she had already decided that Julian Croft was going to be her chief technology officer, that Project Chimera, his flagship logistics AI, bumps, was going to be the centerpiece of her acquisition strategy, and that Damien Blackwood had made a catastrophic error the day he told her to stick to dinner parties. She smiled at her own reflection in the dark train window. Gerald was going to need a bigger windowsill. Acquiring Innovate Dynamics without triggering Damien's radar required the kind of patience that Isabella had been involuntarily developing for 3 years of being managed out of her own marriage. She was, it turned out, extraordinarily good at patience, better than she had known. The vehicle was Phoenix Holdings, a private equity entity incorporated in Geneva through a firm that owed her grandmother a professional favor dating back 15 years. Aldrich Brennan handled the structure with the unhurried precision of a Swiss watchmaker, building layers of subsidiary entities that were individually unremarkable and collectively invisible. There were no press releases, no analyst briefings, no digital footprint that could be traced back to a woman named Isabella Hartley, formerly Blackwood, currently residing in a half-empty apartment on the Upper West Side with a potted plant named Gerald and a wall covered in red marker. The share acquisition began in January and proceeded in small methodical blocks, timed carefully to avoid the volume thresholds that would trigger regulatory disclosure requirements. It was slow. It required discipline. On 3 separate occasions, Isabella saw Damien's name in the financial press in connection with Innovate Dynamics. His team circling, probing, preparing the hostile takeover bid that the market had been anticipating for months. And each time, she felt the particular sharpening of focus that she had come to recognize as her body's response to meaningful competition. He thought he was hunting. He did not know he was being outflanked. By February, Phoenix Holdings held 23%. By April, 38%. By the end of May, Isabella was 7 months pregnant, her bump unmistakable, beneath the blazers she had taken to wearing as a kind of personal uniform. And Phoenix Holdings was at 44% and closing. The final piece was Arthur Kensington. Arthur Kensington was 71 years old, the founder of Innovate Dynamics, and its largest single individual shareholder at 9%. He had built the company 30 years ago out of a genuine conviction that logistics technology could make the movement of goods and people more humane as well as more efficient. That optimization and compassion were not opposites. He had watched 3 successive management teams gradually sand that conviction down to a marketing tagline. He was not happy about it. And he was not, Isabella had concluded, after considerable research, a man who would be moved by the highest bid alone. She flew to Boston to meet him. 7 months pregnant, visibly so, she walked into the stuffy dining room of the Bostonian Club in a charcoal blazer and flat shoes and sat across from a white-haired man with sharp eyes and the handshake of someone who had been testing people's grip since before she was born. She did not hide the pregnancy. She did not apologize for it. She simply sat down, opened her portfolio, and began. She told him everything. Damien's strategy to gut the company and liquidate the patent portfolio. Her own vision for the R&D division, the Chimera project, the untapped commercial potential of the existing customer base. She told him about Julian Croft and the USB drive and the document titled What This Company Could Be. She showed him the modeling. Kensington listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. This was, in Isabella's assessment, the most respectful thing a person had done for her in years. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" he asked. "This is a deeply personal fight, isn't it? The most successful ventures always are," Isabella said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at her stomach. Then he looked at her eyes. "You've got a deal, young lady," he said, and extended his hand. "Give that corporate pirate hell." With Kensington's 9%, Phoenix Holdings crossed 51. Innovate Dynamics was hers. Julian met her outside the lawyer's office in Boston after the signing was complete. He had driven from Cambridge. She had called him from the conference room the moment it was done, and he was leaning against the railing of the building's entrance in the May afternoon sunlight when she came through the glass doors. She stopped at the top of the steps. She looked at him. She was 7 months pregnant and had been awake since 4 in the morning and was wearing flat shoes because her feet had made their position on the matter of heels perfectly clear, and she had just legally acquired controlling interest in a publicly traded technology company through a series of financial maneuvers that she had executed largely from a spare bedroom in a half-empty apartment on the Upper West Side. She started crying, not dramatically, just quietly, the way that certain profound things announce themselves when you finally allow yourself to feel them. Julian walked up the steps and handed her a handkerchief. An actual handkerchief, because Julian was a person who carried handkerchiefs, which Isabella had found mildly old-fashioned and now found entirely perfect. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. He smiled. The baby kicked, which Isabella took as endorsement. The board was legally obligated to accept Phoenix Holdings' controlling stake and convene an emergency session. They scheduled it for the first Monday in June. Isabella appointed Julian as Chief Technology Officer effective immediately, brought in a new CFO named Margaret Ellis, whom she had known from her Harvard network and trusted completely, and began preparing her 100-day plan with the focused energy of someone who has been quietly building toward a single moment for 6 months and intends to arrive at it prepared. She also instructed Mr. Brennan's office to file the necessary disclosures that would, for the first time, associate the name Isabella Hartley with Phoenix Holdings in the public record. These disclosures would be processed and published on the day of the board meeting, the same day that Damian Blackwood's acquisition team was scheduled to file their formal hostile takeover bid. She had not planned that particular timing. The universe apparently had. Damian was having champagne with his senior team when the Bloomberg broadcast interrupted everything. She had not watched it live. She had been in the car on the way to the board meeting, Julian in the passenger seat, Margaret on speakerphone from her office in Midtown, when Chloe sent her a text that read simply, "He just dropped his champagne flute on live television. I am deceased." Isabella had looked out the car window at the morning city moving past. She had felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite sorrow, something more complicated and more real than either. Then she had straightened her jacket, taken a breath, and said to the driver, "We're ready." The boardroom of Innovate Dynamics was not the grandest room Isabella had ever sat in. It was a functional, glass-walled space on the 14th floor of a building that was modest by Manhattan standards. No marble, no mahogany, just good light and a long oval table around which 12 people were currently sitting in various states of apprehension, and one person, specifically Damian Blackwood, was sitting in the particular rigid stillness of a man who has sustained a major blow and is refusing to acknowledge it publicly. He looked, Isabella thought, with a clinical detachment that surprised her, smaller somehow. Not physically. Damian was still tall, still immaculately dressed, still wore his authority like a second suit, but something had gone out of him in the last 72 hours, some fundamental certainty that had previously read as confidence, and now, in its absence, simply looked like emptiness. She did not let herself feel anything about that, not yet. "Good morning, everyone," she said, and took her seat at the head of the table. She had chosen her outfit with care, a cream-colored blazer over a charcoal dress that accommodated her pregnancy with elegance and refused to minimize it. She was 7 months pregnant, visibly and entirely so, and she had decided 3 months ago that her pregnancy was not a vulnerability to be managed, but a fact to be worn with the same authority as everything else about her. She was building 2 futures simultaneously. That was not a weakness. That was remarkable. The 100-day plan took 90 minutes to present. Margaret handled the financial restructuring components. Julian walked the board through the Chimera technology roadmap with the contained excitement of a person who has been waiting to show this work to people who would understand it. Isabella tied everything together with a strategic overview that was, by any honest assessment, the best presentation she had ever given. When she got to the section on Damien's proposed acquisition strategy, referred to throughout only as the approach of our new minority partner, she dismantled it with surgical precision and not a single raised syllable. The flawed assumptions, the short-term liquidation logic, the catastrophic undervaluation of the patent portfolio and the human capital in the R&D division. She let the numbers speak. The numbers were extremely loud. Across the table, Damien attempted to interrupt twice. The first time, "Mr. Blackwood, we have a full agenda. Please hold questions for the designated Q&A at the end." The second time, "A look. Just a look." He stopped. After the meeting, as the room was clearing, he found her by the window. "Isabella," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered it being in the signing room. Something was different in it. She didn't let herself investigate what. "Mr. Blackwood," she said pleasantly, "do you have a business matter to discuss?" "Don't." His jaw tightened. "Don't do that. This is..." "What is this? Revenge?" She turned to face him fully. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for months, and in the rehearsals she had been cold, cutting, perfect. But standing here now, looking at the exhaustion in his face and the confusion in his eyes, she found she didn't need the rehearsed version. The real version was quieter and more final. "This is business," she said. "Something you taught me to value above all else. You saw this company as an asset to be stripped. I see it as something to be built." The board agreed. His eyes dropped to her stomach, and then back up to her face. His voice cracked slightly on the next words. "The baby. Were you ever going to tell me?" She stepped closer. She was aware of how close they were. She was aware of the 7 months, of everything between them. "You forfeited the right to know anything about my personal life when you had your lawyer call mine to schedule the end of our marriage," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "This baby is my personal life. You have no claim here. In this room, you are a shareholder. Outside it, you are nothing. Are we understood?" She turned and walked to where Julian was waiting by the door. He placed a hand briefly on her back as they walked out together. A gesture of support, nothing more. But she knew Damien was watching, and she did not look back. Outside in the hallway, once they were around the corner, she stopped walking and put one hand on the wall and breathed. "Good?" Julian asked. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. He understood, she had come to realize, a great many things without requiring them to be explained. It was one of his more valuable qualities. The stock dip came first, 14% in a single trading day, triggered by an anonymous piece in a financial publication that questioned Chimera's algorithmic foundation and described Phoenix Holdings as a speculative play by an inexperienced operator with more personal motivation than technical expertise. Isabella read the article at 5:47 in the morning, before she had eaten anything or spoken to anyone. She read it once for content and once for structure, identifying the specific technical claims that were false, the ones that were misleadingly framed, and the ones that were technically accurate but deliberately stripped of context. Then she called Julian. He had already read it. He had been awake since 4. "It's Damien," he said. "The sourcing patterns, the specific technical framing. This came from someone who had access to our internal documentation." "How much of our internal documentation?" she asked. "Enough to be dangerous," he said. "Not enough to be accurate." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the city was doing its ordinary morning things, entirely indifferent to the fact that her stock had dropped 14% and someone was trying to take apart the thing she had spent 6 months building. Get the board on a call at 7, she said. I'll handle the investors directly. Start auditing the internal access logs. Find the leak. She spent the next 9 hours on the phone. 3 major investors threatening withdrawal. 2 board members in a state of anxious uncertainty. 1 financial journalist who had clearly received the same anonymous briefing and wanted a comment. She was calm on every call. She was precise, persuasive, and honest about the short-term volatility, while being unequivocal about the long-term fundamentals. By 4 in the afternoon, she had stabilized 2 of the 3 investors and had a written commitment from the third to hold pending the upcoming Chimera demonstration. That night, after everyone had gone, she sat alone in her office with a cup of chamomile tea going cold on her desk, and she allowed herself, privately and briefly, to feel how tired she was. Not defeated, not frightened, just tired. The way that people who have been carrying very heavy things for a long time sometimes feel the weight of them in the quiet. Chloe came by at 8 with food. She did not ask how Isabella was doing. She simply put the food on the desk, sat in the chair across from her, and said, "Eat first, then tell me." Isabella ate. Then she told her. Chloe was quiet for a moment. Then, "He is going to be so sorry." "He already is," Isabella said. "He just doesn't know the shape of it yet." The internal audit identified Victoria Sterling within 48 hours. She was a senior VP of sales who had been on a trajectory toward the C-suite under the previous management and had watched that trajectory evaporate when Isabella restructured the leadership team. Her resentment was not subtle upon examination. Email metadata, access logs, and encrypted communication to an external address that Julian's security team traced in 4 hours. Margaret Ellis recommended immediate termination and legal action. Isabella agreed. Victoria was gone by Thursday morning. What she did not know yet was what Victoria had already delivered. The injunction arrived on a Friday afternoon, filed by Blackwood Enterprises Legal, claiming that Innovate Dynamics' internal strategic documentation had been improperly transferred to Phoenix Holdings during the acquisition process and constituted intellectual property theft. It was, on any careful legal reading, a weak claim. Their attorney, a quiet and formidably competent woman named Diane Price, told her so within an hour of the filing. Weak, however, does not mean fast, Diane said. Fighting this properly will take 6 weeks minimum. If the court grants a temporary freeze on asset transfers, you may need to delay the Chimera demonstration. Julian was in the room. He said nothing, but Isabella saw his jaw tighten. "If we delay the demonstration, we lose the investors," Isabella said. "Yes," Diane said. "Then we don't delay." Diane filed the emergency motion on Saturday morning. The judge, reviewing it over the weekend, ruled in Isabella's favor by Friday noon. The injunction was dismissed. The demonstration would proceed as scheduled on Monday. Isabella exhaled in her office chair for what felt like the first time in a week. She called Julian. "We're clear." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. See you Monday." She put the phone down. She looked at Gerald on the windowsill. Gerald, as always, had no comment. She allowed herself 45 seconds of genuine relief. Then her phone rang. It was Diane. "I need you to listen carefully," Diane said. "Our security team has just identified a significant unauthorized access event on the main Chimera server. Someone was in the system overnight, not browsing, placing something." Isabella sat very still. "Placed what?" she asked. "We don't know exactly," Diane said, "but the access patterns suggest someone was looking for a specific vulnerability. Something they already knew was there." Isabella thought about Julian's audit, the minor recursive loop error in Chimera's core algorithm, logged as low priority, patch scheduled for the following week. She thought about the demonstration. Monday, the final stress test. The high-pressure simulation. She thought about Damien in his penthouse, watching. She thought about Victoria Sterling's encrypted external communications. She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, clarity. "Don't patch it," she said. Diane was silent. "Don't patch the vulnerability on the main server," Isabella repeated. "I need to make a call." Julian arrived at her office at 11 on Saturday night because she had asked him to, and because he was Julian, he was there at 10:58 with 2 cups of coffee and the particular focused energy of a man who has just understood something important and is ready to act on it. She had been sitting at her whiteboard for 2 hours. It was covered again, the way it had been in the spare bedroom in the beginning, with arrows and timelines and circled questions. But this time the structure was different. This time she was not building a plan forward. She was building a trap backward. She explained what she was thinking. Julian listened without interrupting, the way he always did, his coffee forgotten in his hand. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his coffee, picked up a marker, and walked to the whiteboard. "I've actually been building this for 3 weeks, he said. She stared at him. He drew a diagram. 2 parallel server architectures. One labeled main, connected to the external network, containing the documented vulnerability in the Chimera algorithm. One labeled shadow, air-gapped, running on a completely separate private system, containing the fully patched, fully operational version of Chimera that had been running uninterrupted since Julian first identified the network probe 3 weeks ago. Every access attempt on the main server has been logged, he said. Every probe, every packet of data, every interaction, the timestamps, the IP addresses, the specific data payloads. The whole trail is there. You let me panic for 10 days, Isabella said. You needed to look genuinely stressed for the board, Julian said. The crying was very convincing. She looked at him. I hate you, she said. No, you don't, he said. She looked at the diagram. She looked at Julian. She looked at the diagram again. The demonstration on Monday, she said slowly. We run it on the shadow server, correct? And whatever they send to the main server to trigger the vulnerability bounces off a honeypot that's been designed to absorb it, log it, and record every fingerprint of the attempt in real time, in front of every investor, every board member, and every journalist in that auditorium, she said. And on the live broadcast, Julian confirmed. Isabella sat down in her chair. She put her hands flat on the desk. She breathed. Then she looked up at him, and she said, Julian Croft, you are the most impressive person I have ever worked with, he smiled. It was, she had noticed over the past months, a very good smile. Quiet and real, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. Likewise, he said, get some sleep. Monday is going to be a long day. The auditorium held 240 people on Monday morning, and all 240 of them were there. Institutional investors in the front rows, board members to the left, press in the back. Julian's R&D team lined up along the right wall with the barely contained excitement of people who have spent 3 years building something extraordinary and are about to watch it work in front of an audience for the first time. Isabella stood in the wings watching the room fill. Margaret was beside her, reviewing the financial slides one final time with the methodical attention of a person for whom one final time meant something literal. Julian was at the technical console at the back of the stage, running through the server connection protocols, checking the shadow system's status with the quiet focus of a surgeon before a procedure. Chloe, who had no professional reason to be there and had simply shown up because she refused to miss this, was in the third row, from the back wearing a blazer she had borrowed from Isabella's closet and eating a granola bar with significant composure. In a penthouse 40 blocks away, on a large screen tuned to the live broadcast feed, Damian Blackwood was watching. He was on an encrypted chat channel with the Eastern European cybersecurity firm he had paid through 4 layers of offshore accounts to deliver a precisely targeted data packet to the Chimera system's documented vulnerability at the exact moment of the high-pressure stress test. He had also been texting Victoria Sterling, who was in the audience. Victoria had confirmed the access credentials were still on the main server. Julian's patch was not scheduled until next week. They had not suspected a thing. Damien felt good. He felt the clean, cold satisfaction of a man who has restored order to a situation that had become unreasonably complicated. This was just business. She had started it. He was simply finishing it with greater skill. He poured himself a glass of water. He watched the live feed. He waited. Isabella walked onto the stage to applause that was warm but cautious. The applause of an audience that wanted to believe in her but was still waiting for the evidence. She was 8 months pregnant, and she moved with the particular grace of a woman who has long since stopped apologizing for taking up space. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about Innovate Dynamics, its history, its people, its potential. She talked about the 17 patents and the R&D division and the specific commercial applications of the Chimera platform that would generate, by conservative modeling, revenues that made the current stock price almost comically undervalued. She talked about vision, about what it meant to see a company not for what it currently was, but for what it could become if someone believed in it completely. She did not talk about Damian Blackwood. She did not need to. Then Julian stepped to the technical console and said, "And now I would like to show you what Chimera actually does." The initial demonstrations were flawless. Port logistics optimization in real time, multivariable supply chain rerouting, dynamic traffic management across a simulated urban grid. The room's cautious applause was becoming something warmer and more genuine with each sequence. The particular shift in energy that happens when an audience stops waiting to be impressed and starts actually being impressed. "And now," Julian said, his voice carrying a restrained pride that Isabella found, in the moment, deeply moving, "the final test. We will simulate a full-scale citywide logistics crisis, a port shutdown, a bridge collapse, and a transit strike, simultaneously. This is the highest stress scenario our platform is designed to handle." He initiated the simulation. On the main server, the honeypot, the trap, the carefully maintained decoy, a data packet arrived at precisely this moment, traveling from a server farm in Eastern Europe through 4 anonymized relay points, carrying a precisely encoded instruction set designed to trigger the recursive loop vulnerability in Chimera's core algorithm and cause a catastrophic, unrecoverable system crash in front of 240 witnesses and a live broadcast audience. The packet was absorbed, logged, fingerprinted, time-stamped, and neutralized by the honeypot architecture Julian had spent 3 weeks building. On the shadow server, the real Chimera processed the stress test with breathtaking speed and elegance. The logistics crisis, 3 simultaneous catastrophic failures in a simulated city of 4 million people, was resolved in 11.3 seconds. Goods rerouted. Transit alternatives generated. Emergency vehicle pathways cleared. The system did not just hold under the pressure. It improved. Its efficiency metrics at peak stress were higher than at baseline load. The auditorium was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then it erupted. Isabella let the applause build, and then raised one hand, gently and the room quieted. "Thank you," she said. "We are, of course, thrilled with Chimera's performance today." She paused. "We were also aware that certain parties might have an unusual interest in the outcome of this demonstration." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one before the applause. It was the silence of 240 people simultaneously recalibrating. "Which is why," Isabella continued, "we took certain precautions. Several weeks ago, our security team detected unauthorized probing of our network. In response, we created a honeypot, a decoy version of the Chimera system on our main servers, left in place with a specific known vulnerability. The demonstration you just witnessed was running on a completely separate, hardened, and fully patched private server." She found the primary broadcast camera. Every digital fingerprint of the attempted intrusion, every data packet, every IP address, every payment trail has been logged, traced, and documented. Our legal team has been in contact with the relevant authorities since this morning. She paused one final time. "We take corporate integrity very seriously at Innovate Dynamics." She let the words settle. "And we intend to prove it." In the penthouse, Damien's phone was already ringing. Marcus Vance's voice was a controlled panic. "They're flipping Damien. The cyber firm. They have a deal on the table, and they're giving you up to get it. The payment trails, the instructions, everything. It's over." Damien set the phone down on his desk. On the screen, Isabella stepped back from the podium. Julian was beside her. The auditorium was producing a sound that was not quite applause anymore, that had moved past applause into something more continuous and less formal. The sound of a room full of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for a long time. The champagne from his premature celebration 3 days ago was still on the bar behind him. He did not look at it. The headlines were still scrolling 3 days later and showed no signs of stopping. Blackwood's Dirty War. The full story. Fallen Titan. Damien Blackwood faces SEC investigation and board ouster. From predator to prey. How Isabella Hartley outmaneuvered the man who underestimated her. The last move, inside the honeypot, that brought down a billionaire. Damien had read them all. He had read them the way a doctor reads a difficult diagnosis, not looking for hope, just looking for the precise shape of what was happening to him. His phone had stopped ringing sometime in the second day. Not because the calls had ceased. The calls had not ceased. There were lawyers and board members and investors and journalists trying to reach him in a volume that would have required a team to manage. But because he had simply put the phone face down on the marble coffee table and stopped looking at it, the notification light blinked at him steadily in the dimming light of the apartment, patient and relentless, like a small indifferent heartbeat. Veronica Cole had cleaned out her office on Tuesday. She had done it quietly, efficiently, and entirely alone in the early morning before the rest of the staff arrived, and she had left without a note or a conversation or any acknowledgement of the particular disaster that her choices had contributed to. She was in Chicago by Wednesday, he had been told, a smaller firm, a lower title. She had not called him. He had not expected her to. He understood, with a clarity that would have been useful earlier, that what he and Veronica had shared had never been, in any meaningful sense, about either of them as full human beings. It had been about the particular validation that comes from wanting what someone else has and being given it. Once the thing being given lost its value, the transaction was complete. He had mistaken a transaction for a relationship. And the irony was that this was precisely what he had done to Isabella, in the opposite direction, for 3 years. He sat in his living room for a long time On the evening of the third day, he had curated this life with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his portfolio. He had stripped away softness, warmth, anything that could not be quantified or controlled. He had called it optimization. He had called it success. He had built a kingdom of glass and steel and silence and called it the life he had chosen. He thought about the Amalfi Coast. He thought about the rickety boat and the local fishermen and the 60 minutes when he had not been Damian Blackwood, CEO, but simply a man, happy and entirely present in a turquoise sea. He had been terrified by that happiness, not by its fragility, by its reality, by the fact that it had arrived without strategy, without engineering, without any contribution from his considerable intelligence and ambition. It had just happened because Isabella had laughed and taken his hand and convinced him to step out of his plan for an hour. He understood now what he had been afraid of. He had been afraid of loving something he could not control and therefore could not protect from loss. So he had chosen the loss himself. He had engineered it, filed it, and handed it across a mahogany desk and called it a clean cut. The most expensive stupidity of his life, and he had been the one to execute it. He stood up. He put on his jacket. He did not call his driver. He took the elevator down to the garage, got in his Aston Martin, and merged into the river of city traffic. The city looked different through the windshield tonight. Not a chessboard, not a market, just a city full of people living complicated lives with no particular awareness of or interest in the rise and fall of Damian Blackwood. He drove to innovate dynamics. Clara, Isabella's executive assistant, was still at her desk at 7 in the evening because Clara was extremely good at her job and took that seriously. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, standing immediately when he emerged from the elevator. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartley isn't—" "I know," he said. His voice was quiet. He walked past her. He found Isabella at her window, one hand on the glass, one hand on her belly, looking at the last light over the city. She didn't turn. She had heard him. He knew she had heard him. "I told Clara I wasn't to be disturbed, Damien," she said. Her voice was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Anger had a weight that came from heat. This was something older and colder and more final. "I'm not here about the company," he said. He stopped in the center of the room, feeling for the first time in years that he did not know where to stand. She waited. "I know it's over," he said. "I know what I did. I know what it cost. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here because there is something I needed to say that has no legal or strategic component, and I could not go another day without saying it." A long silence. He said it, all of it, not the practiced version he might have delivered in a boardroom, clean, controlled, designed for effect. The real version, the one that shook in his voice and pulled at the edges and said things about fear and cowardice and the terrible irony of a man who destroyed his best asset because he was afraid of how much he valued it. He talked about the boat in Amalfi. He talked about what he had done in the signing room, not just to her, but to their child, to something irreplaceable, because he was terrified of a feeling he couldn't manage. He said he did not deserve forgiveness. He said he was not asking for it. He said he was asking for one thing and one thing only. His voice broke on the next sentence. "The baby," he said. "He or she, they didn't do anything to deserve any of this. They deserve a father. If you'll let me, I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to be in their life, not as your husband. I threw away that right, just as their father, just as the man I should have been." He stopped. There was nothing else. Isabella turned. Her eyes swept over him. The disheveled jacket, the exhaustion in his face, the raw and unfamiliar openness of a man who has finally taken off the armor he'd been wearing so long he'd forgotten it wasn't his skin. She looked at him for a long time. "Your apology," she said at last. Her voice was soft and steady and final. "I hear it, Damien. I believe it." She paused. "And it doesn't rebuild what you burned. Words don't rebuild that. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the door is open, because it isn't. Not in the way you mean, what you did, the signing room, the sabotage, all of it. I carried that every single day while I was building this. I carried it, and I kept going anyway. And I think that means it's mine now, not yours. Mine." He nodded. Just nodded. "But the baby," she said. Her voice changed on those words, became something more careful. "The baby didn't make any of those choices." She was going to say something more, but then her face changed. A sharp intake of breath. Her free hand flew to her lower back. She gripped the edge of her oak desk, her knuckles white. Damien was across the room before he had made the decision to move. "Isabella," he said. "What is it?" She was breathing through something, her eyes closed, her jaw set. When the wave passed, she opened her eyes and looked at him, and her expression was something he had never seen on her face before. Surprised and afraid and fiercely alive. "The baby," she said. "Damien, I think it's time." The hospital was clean and quiet, and had the particular stripped-down clarity of a place where the essential things were happening, and there was no room for anything else. Damien sat in the waiting area, outside the delivery suite, not in a private lounge, not in a suite he had arranged. The waiting area, with the plastic chairs and the soft institutional lighting and the muted television, showing a weather forecast for a city that was not currently relevant to anything happening in his life. He was there because Isabella had allowed him to be there, and he understood that this was a conditional and revocable permission, not an entitlement, and he intended to behave accordingly. Chloe Merritt was inside. Chloe had arrived at the hospital approximately 7 minutes after Isabella, having been called from across the city, and had walked past Damien in the waiting area with an expression that communicated, without any words, a complete and exhaustive inventory of every opinion she held about him. She had not said a single one of those words. She had simply walked past, into the delivery suite, and closed the door. He respected her for that. It occurred to him that Chloe Merritt had probably been protecting Isabella from things she couldn't protect herself from for longer than he had been paying attention. He sat in the plastic chair. He didn't look at his phone. For the first time in as long as he could remember, there was nothing on his phone that was more important than waiting. Inside the delivery suite, Chloe was attempting to be a supportive birth coach, which she had confidently told Isabella she was fully prepared to do, and for which she had, in fact, watched 2 YouTube tutorial videos in the car on the way over. She was doing reasonably well until the nurse placed an IV line, at which point Chloe sat down somewhat abruptly on the floor. The nurse stepped over her with the professional composure of someone who had seen this before. Isabella, in the middle of a contraction, looked at her best friend sitting on the hospital floor with her back against the wall and her eyes at half-mast, and said, "Chloe." "I'm fine," Chloe said from the floor. "This is a choice. I am choosing to sit here. You are the worst birth coach in the history of birth coaching." I did watch the videos. A nurse helped Chloe into a chair. Isabella laughed, which helped with the contraction more than any breathing technique. Amelia rose. Hartley was born at 2:17 in the morning. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Dark hair like her father. Hands that were immediately and perfectly formed, the nurse said, with the particular authority of someone who had seen a great many hands. Chloe was crying. She was also simultaneously texting, presumably Chloe-specific multitasking. The nurse came out to the waiting area 20 minutes later. Ms. Hartley is asking if the father would like to come in. Damien stood up. He was not a man who was accustomed to needing a moment before doing things, but he needed one now. He breathed. Then he walked through the door. Isabella was holding the baby. She looked exhausted and triumphant in the way that people look when they have done something immense and are still in the immediate aftermath of it, not yet fully arrived in the new world it has created. Chloe was beside her, still slightly pale, holding Isabella's hand with a fierce possessiveness that she did not modify when Damien entered. He stopped at the foot of the bed. He looked at Amelia. The thing that happened to his face in that moment was not something he would have been able to describe. Later, in the long aftermath, he would sometimes try to find the words for it and not quite get there. It was not simply love, though it was that. It was more like recognition, like meeting someone he had been waiting his whole life to meet, without knowing he was waiting. "You can hold her," Isabella said. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. The nurse placed Amelia in his arms with the practiced efficiency of someone entrusting a precious thing to a person who has just been vetted, provisionally, for the purpose. Amelia opened her eyes for a moment, dark, unfocused, entirely unimpressed with the world she had arrived in or the person currently holding her. Then she closed them again and went back to the more important business of sleeping. Damien held her. He did not speak for a long time. "Thank you," he said at last. He was looking at Amelia. The words were for Isabella. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression held a great many things that she was choosing, with precision, not to say. She nodded, just nodded. The day before Isabella was discharged, she had a conversation with her attorney, Diane Price, about the co-parenting framework. She had thought about this carefully over several weeks, and she had arrived at a set of terms that were clear and fair and left no room for ambiguity. Damien would have regular, scheduled time with Amelia. He would have no legal or financial claim on Isabella's professional life or her company. Their communication would be co-parent specific unless both of them chose to make it otherwise, which she did not anticipate and was not planning around. She also had a conversation with Chloe, which was less formal and took place at the foot of the hospital bed while Amelia slept in the bassinet and the city outside the window did its ordinary things in the early morning light. "He really loved you," Chloe said. Past tense, present tense, I honestly can't tell. Which is the worst part? "I know," Isabella said. "Is there any part of you—" "There is always a part of me," Isabella said. "That's not the question. The question is what I do with that part. And the answer is, I build something real, and I raise my daughter, and I let him prove through actions whether he's actually the person he says he wants to be. That takes years, not declarations." Chloe was quiet. "That is the most emotionally mature thing you have ever said," she said finally. "I am deeply proud of you, and also slightly intimidated." Isabella looked at Amelia, sleeping. She looked like someone who had arrived with very specific plans for the world and was resting before implementing them. Good, Isabella thought. Same kid. Same 6 months later. The Forbes profile ran in the October issue. The photograph showed Isabella at her desk in the Innovate Dynamics office, Amelia's drawing, a series of confident orange circles that could have been suns or flowers or evidence of a very specific artistic vision. Taped to the corner of her monitor, the headline read, "The CEO who built an empire while building a life." The subheadline, which Isabella had not been consulted about and which Chloe had texted her in all caps at 7 in the morning when the digital edition went live, read, "The most elegant comeback story on Wall Street." Project Chimera had launched commercially in September. Within 6 weeks, 3 major logistics providers had signed enterprise contracts. The stock had tripled from the price on the day of Isabella's Bloomberg debut. Julian had been promoted to president in July, the announcement received by the market as confirmation of a leadership team that was not only capable, but stable. Margaret Ellis, in a board meeting in August, had described the company's trajectory with her characteristic precision as, and I quote, exactly what the model projected, which for Margaret was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Victoria Sterling had quietly settled her civil liability in the sabotage case. The Eastern European cyber firm's principals had pled to reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation with federal investigators. Damien had faced an SEC investigation, a board ouster, and the particular slow-motion public reckoning of a man whose previous professional mythology had been built partly on the story that he was too smart to make this kind of mistake. He had accepted all of it, without public deflection or blame-shifting, which was noted in the press as surprising and noted by Isabella as the first evidence that he was, in fact, trying to become someone different. He showed up every Saturday morning. This had begun in January, 2 months after Amelia was born, when he had texted Isabella a single sentence, "I would like to see her, just for an hour. Wherever you are most comfortable." She had told him about Chloe's coffee shop in the West Village, where she and Amelia had developed a Saturday morning routine. He had shown up on the following Saturday, 5 minutes early, in a different kind of jacket than he used to wear. Still good quality, but softer somehow. And he had sat in the corner booth and held Amelia and talked to her in a low voice about things she couldn't understand and hadn't interrupted. He had come back every Saturday, 52 Saturdays now, through the winter and the spring and the summer, and into the new fall. He did not ask for more than he was given. He did not make declarations. He brought Amelia a small toy every third or fourth week, something simple and age-appropriate, and he put it on the table without fanfare and waited to see if Amelia wanted it. Amelia, who was 6 months old and had formed strong opinions about the world already, had decided that she found him interesting. She grabbed his fingers with a determination that Isabella found structurally similar to certain business negotiations she had witnessed. Chloe had started leaving the booth to make phone calls whenever Damien arrived, giving him the corner with Amelia and a studied casualness that fooled neither of them. He was rebuilding. A smaller company, private this time, focused on operational consulting. It had no media profile and no particular desire for one. It was, by all early indications, excellent work done quietly by a person who had stopped needing the kingdom to know his name. Isabella had not told him what to think about any of this. It was not her project. Julian knocked on the open office door at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning in October, as he did most mornings, because they had an 8:45 standing meeting and Julian was constitutionally incapable of being late. "Board meeting in 5, he said. "Ready?" "Always," she said. She stood. She straightened her jacket, the charcoal one, the one that had been with her since the beginning. She looked for a moment at the city outside her window. The ordinary, magnificent city doing its ordinary, magnificent things in the October morning light. She thought, briefly, about a cold Tuesday 2 years ago. A mahogany desk, a pen that scratched across thick cream paper, an elevator with mirrored doors that had closed on one version of her life and opened on something she had not yet been able to imagine. She thought about Eleanor, her grandmother, who had known and had protected her and had been waiting. She thought about Amelia, home with her nanny, probably conducting some experiment involving the contents of the kitchen cabinet. Absolutely her mother's daughter. Julian was watching her. He was patient with her thinking. He had always been patient with her thinking. "Oh," he said suddenly, pointing to the shelf beside the window. Gerald survived the office move. Gerald sat on his windowsill with the serene dignity of a survivor. He had been through a great deal. He looked, if anything, more flourishing than when the whole thing began. Of course he did, Isabella said. She picked up her folder and headed for the door. He's the only man who ever really listened. Julian laughed. It was, as always, a quiet and real laugh that reached his eyes and stayed there. They walked out together, down the hall, into the morning that was entirely theirs. There is something that therapists and coaches and the very wise people in your own life have been telling you, possibly for years, about the relationship between loss and direction. They say that the most powerful transformations rarely begin with a plan. They begin with a door closing, sometimes softly, sometimes like a verdict, and the particular silence that follows. Isabella Hartley did not plan her revolution on the day her marriage ended. She planned it in the weeks and months that followed, in the spare bedroom, at the whiteboard, on the phone, with Swiss lawyers and R&D engineers and sharp-eyed Boston founders who could see the fire in her eyes and decided to bet on it. She built it from what she had been told she didn't have. She used the skills she'd been told were not needed. She funded it with money her grandmother had quietly set aside because one wise woman had seen what Isabella couldn't yet see in herself. The lesson is not that every betrayal leads to a billion-dollar company. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. The lesson is, other people's assessment of your value is not your balance sheet. The lesson is, the expertise you have been quietly contributing to someone else's empire belongs to you, and it goes with you when you leave, and the market outside that empire does not know yet what you know, and when you show it, the market responds. The lesson is, build the thing. Build it when you are afraid. Build it when you are exhausted. Build it with the money your grandmother hid for you, and the engineer who had a USB drive waiting for someone to ask the right question, and the best friend who sits on the hospital floor but never actually leaves. Build it for the baby who kicks when the deal closes. Build it for yourself. Build it because the bookshelf you assembled alone at midnight, crooked but standing, was the first evidence that you could construct things in the dark. And when the day comes, and it will come, when the thing you built is stronger than anything that was used to diminish you, and the man who handed you your walking papers is sitting in a corner booth on Saturday mornings, patient and humbled, waiting for your daughter to decide he is interesting enough to grab his finger. On that day, you do not need to say a single word. You just walk down the hallway in your charcoal blazer, with your folder in your hand, and your partner at your side, and your daughter's orange circles taped to your monitor, and you step into the morning you made with your own hands, and you begin. Again, always. Editorial disclaimer. The story you just heard was researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team with a single purpose: to deliver meaning, not just entertainment. Every dramatic element, every turning point, every moment of resilience in this narrative was built around real emotional truths that we believe matter. The truth that contribution deserves recognition, that silence is not weakness, that the most powerful moves are often the quietest ones. This content is a work of dramatic fiction created for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. We are committed to bringing you stories that leave you with something worth carrying. Thank you for listening.